Um, I think it's 4 p.m. and I think it's fair to go ahead and get started. Everyone ready, Jay?
Yep, ready.
Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining DataCon LA 2020. Welcome to the Business Intelligence Reporting and Use Cases track. And soon we'll be listening to the Maximizing Impact of Analytics Teams session with Jay Bansal. I am Ozzy Tarula, your host, and our co-host today is Michelle Ifiola. We'll be moderating the chat and Q&A for you during the session. Today we have our guest, Jay Bansal, and he will be talking about maximizing the impact of analytics teams. Jay is a seasoned data scientist with experience in the digital marketing, consumer packaged goods, and healthcare industries, among others. He's a Pennsylvania native and now calls California home. Without further ado, I'll hand this over to the speaker. Thanks for being here, Jay.
All right, thanks very much, Ozzy and Michelle. So I just shared my slides, just want to confirm that everyone can see them.
Yes.
All right, great. Awesome. Thanks again, Ozzy and Michelle. Hi, everyone. Thanks for attending my talk. So today, as you heard, I'll be speaking about how to maximize the impact of analytics teams. It's a really common challenge for companies to struggle when integrating analytics into their overall business. This is especially frustrating because creating an analytics department typically isn't cheap. It requires expensive investments like data scientists, engineers, infrastructure, etc. While successfully integrating analytics into your business isn't easy, there are several approaches that teams can take to reach their full potential. I'll be providing actionable recommendations on how to do exactly that. But before I do that, I'll tell you a little bit about my experience in this field. I studied math and economics as a student. This was back before the time when you could get a degree in data science. And I've been working in analytics for about 6 years now as a data scientist. My career so far has spanned a few different industries, including digital marketing, consumer packaged goods, consulting, and currently healthcare. Those experiences have exposed me to both analytics teams and companies of various sizes and structures. One small disclaimer here, my current employer has a pretty sizable legal team, and so I want to make it very clear that all views expressed in this talk are my own and that I'm not representing my current company in any way. Disclaimer aside, reflecting on the experiences I've had is what motivated me to try and distill some of the most common problems that analytics teams can run into. Everything I'll be discussing today is an issue that I personally have dealt with at some point. I would consider this talk a success if it can help even a few of you in the audience avoid some of the pitfalls that I fell into. The issues I'll be discussing can apply to teams of any size, but are probably most relevant for small or fairly new analytics departments. Before I dive into these challenges, I want to say a bit more about the stage of analytics team that this talk is designed for. On the slide here, you can see the analytics hierarchy of needs. To be transparent, I didn't come up with this idea, but I think it's a sensible and useful way to think about the different stages of analytics. It's loosely modeled on Maslow's famous hierarchy of needs, so the most fundamental needs are on the bottom, and those must be met before moving up the pyramid. Now, there are obviously a lot of different ways you could organize the analytics version of this pyramid, but I'll walk through the structure that made the most sense to me. Starting at the bottom, we have collecting data, as in your company needs to be collecting and storing the raw data that's relevant to its business processes. Obviously, you can't get very far in analytics without data. Next is organizing data. After collecting the data, it needs to be stored in a way such that the analytics team or any relevant stakeholders can actually access it and query it. These first two tiers typically need a lot of data engineering resources. The next tier is cleaning and transformation. This is where somebody quality checks the data and makes sure that it yields sensible results to simple business questions. After that is the descriptive analysis tier, which involves using your data to find answers to new questions from the business. And finally, at the very top is predictive analytics, including machine learning, deep learning, and any future relevant buzzwords. So the reason I'm talking about this pyramid is to show which stages this talk is most relevant to. Unfortunately, nothing I'm going to say today is really going to help with the first two tiers. If you don't have any data or you don't have any useful data, this is probably not the talk for you. This talk is most useful for teams or companies in the third and fourth tiers of this pyramid. At this point, there's at least some existing analytics infrastructure, but it's probably not completely built out. And finally, at the top, if your company is at the ML AI stage of this pyramid, there's a decent chance that it already has a strong analytics culture and has implemented a lot of what I'm going to talk about. So with that framing in mind, let's jump in. The structure of my talk is pretty straightforward. I'll introduce 3 overarching challenges that analytics teams often face, present a few potential solutions to each, and then finally wrap up with a section on where analytics fits in an organization's overall structure. So the big challenges that I'll be talking about are analytics being used as a weapon, teams having low bandwidth, and an overall lack of trust in analytics at a company. Now, these are certainly not the only obstacles that an analytics department can face, but they're broad enough to apply to many situations and allow for a variety of solutions. So the first challenge that I want to talk about is teams being pressured to use analytics as a weapon. For teams facing this challenge, business stakeholders already know the answers that they're looking for when they ask questions. There's no interest in rigorous analytical work or actually exploring and learning from the data. Analytics in this case consists of basically manipulating analysis until the results come out to a predetermined answer. Analytics is being used as a weapon to hammer home a conclusion, regardless of whether that conclusion is actually true or not. My personal experience with this challenge involved testing the effectiveness of an email campaign. I was working with a pretty high-level business stakeholder, and the results we were getting initially suggested that our campaign had not had the intended effect, or really any effect at all. Unfortunately, the path we ended up going down involved manipulating our testing control groups. We would add in a group of users here, exclude another group there, and basically repeat this process until we found a combination such that our results came out to what was quote unquote expected. This incident actually happened years ago at this point, but it still really sticks out for me because of just how frustrating it was. Although it might seem pretty obvious, I'll explicitly call out the reasons that this situation is less than ideal. First and foremost, any work done under these conditions is simply not reliable. Analytics, in this case, is being used to confirm what someone else has decided is the correct answer without applying the proper rigor. This means that the business is likely making a suboptimal decision. It's even worse than not using analytics at all. Depending on your use case and context, there might even be ethical issues here. Besides the lack of quality of the analysis, this type of work is also not going to be enjoyable for your team, and so is not sustainable long-term. It essentially turns your team into an arm of the marketing department. And finally, by taking on this kind of work, there's a risk that your analytics team becomes a sort of rubber stamp department, as opposed to one that conducts high-quality, independent analysis. The seemingly obvious solution to this challenge is to push back and not do this sort of work. In reality, it can be a bit more complicated. Business stakeholders don't always necessarily realize when they're creating these sorts of conditions. They may genuinely want to use analytics, but don't know or understand best practices. In my experience, unfortunately, sometimes you end up getting roped into this sort of work despite your best efforts. At a tactical level, I would encourage you to push back as much as reasonably possible by trying to educate your stakeholders on why this approach to analytics doesn't add value. It's not a good use of anyone's resources. Also, try to understand what topics in your company and which stakeholders in particular are most prone to this behavior. In the worst case, you can try to deprioritize working with these topics and stakeholders in the future. Thinking longer term though, this avoidance strategy is obviously not ideal. Moving forward, your team should try to create a culture where this mindset of using analytics as a weapon is simply not prevalent. This is in many ways a stakeholder education and trust issue. Some of the longer term solutions that I'll discuss in the lack of trust challenge can contribute to building this improved analytics culture. The next issue I want to talk about is teams having low bandwidth. This challenge is pretty self-explanatory. It means that there are way more opportunities where analytics can be applied than your team could possibly work on. So with this definition, even a large team can have low bandwidth. This challenge also encompasses a situation where roles that typically enable analytics don't exist at your company. For example, business translators, project managers, or data engineers. I ran into this challenge while working on a data science team at a fairly large company. Our team was centrally located, so we weren't assigned to any specific business unit. The advantage of this setup was that we had the latitude to pursue projects across the business. We were able to meet with lots of different stakeholders and learn all about their various challenges. As a result, our project backlog was always full, and we had the latitude to pick and choose the work that we thought would be most impactful and interesting to us. So we ended up choosing projects that allowed us to work with a variety of departments, which was great in that we got to touch many different areas of the business. But the downsides there were that it was easy to get stretched thin, and we had to constantly context switch between our projects. So with this sort of situation in mind, and the benefit of hindsight, I'll talk about solutions to the low bandwidth challenge that center around two concepts. The first is focusing, which is pretty much the exact opposite of what I did when faced with this challenge. In a situation like this, it can be tempting to try and do something in every area of the business. Especially for new teams, showing value everywhere can seem like the best way to get established. However, my recommendation would instead be to focus on a few specific areas and prioritize depth. Working on too many areas can spread your team thin, since you need to learn the priorities, data, and ways of thinking from multiple stakeholders or even departments. And of course, you'll have more relationships to manage. Instead, prioritize working on a smaller number of subjects. Doing this minimizes context switching and allows your team to build expertise. When picking your projects in this way, keep two things in mind. First, you want to do work that impacts your company's major objectives. This is the best way to increase the visibility of and engagement with your team's work. Now, picking projects to focus on major company objectives might sound pretty obvious, but the contrast I would draw here is with what I call science projects. Science projects are ideas that might be interesting from a technical point of view, or tasks that have the potential to yield business value or increased capabilities at some point down the road. But what really defines a science project for me is that no one in the business is really eager to see your results, at least not in the short term. Science projects can still be worth your time, especially if they could potentially pay dividends in the future, but they shouldn't be designated as one of your team's main priorities. Picking projects that impact your company's major goals is sometimes going to mean not working on the most interesting idea, or it might mean not using particularly advanced analytics techniques. The most important thing is to show value against your organization's most pressing issues using whatever tools and techniques are most appropriate for the job. The second, equally important aspect to consider is who your business stakeholders are for a given project. The more comfortable they are with analytics, the better. Working with analytics savvy stakeholders will help your model or analysis gain more traction and makes it more likely that whatever you build will be used and used properly. So while educating your colleagues about analytics is important, when choosing the projects that your team will prioritize, I would recommend looking for stakeholders that already know something about analytics. Finally, after you've picked your projects based on these two criteria, I would suggest creating a long-term roadmap no matter how small your team is. Doing this can begin to make the case for additional resources, whether that's in terms of headcount, infrastructure, or tooling. So that's focus. The next solution that falls under the low bandwidth challenge is empowering your colleagues. My prior advice on picking projects really focused on prioritizing ruthlessly, but that doesn't mean that you should ignore the rest of your organization. There are still ways you can empower your colleagues with analytics, short of directly working with them on a major initiative. The goal of the suggestions here are to improve your organization's analytical knowledge, level, and capabilities. One way is developing trainings. This is probably the most straightforward way to up-level analytics skills at your company. Some really common technical topics to develop trainings on are on Python, R, or SQL, but you don't need to be limited to technical languages and frameworks. You can also develop more introductory trainings around statistics or analytical thinking or data visualization. And these more general training ideas might have a much broader appeal and attract more of your business stakeholders. Another way to empower your colleagues is by serving as an internal consultant. Instead of committing significant resources to executing a project end to end, serve as an analytics advisor to work already taking place in your company. This approach will let you add value and promote analytical best practices while still conserving your bandwidth. And finally, think about tools you can build to make your colleagues' lives easier and more productive in terms of analytics. Maybe you can write a function that makes it easier to connect to your company's finicky database, or a function to quickly calculate some key metrics, or to automate some repetitive tasks. These ideas are worth devoting at least some time to, as they make you and everyone around you more productive. The final challenge that I want to talk about today is your organization having an overall lack of trust in analytics. This challenge is by far the most general one, and it can manifest in many different ways. At its core, the issue here is that business stakeholders don't trust analytics enough to use it effectively. Many organizations have analytics teams, but still don't take a data-driven approach to making decisions. Stakeholders might not understand this field or may not believe it provides enough value to justify the cost, or perhaps they don't think it's needed at all and that experience and gut feeling are enough to make decisions in the company. Unfortunately, if an organization doesn't trust its analytics team or understand the value of data, it won't fully realize the benefits of either. A common way that this challenge manifests is when analytics is treated as an accessory. In this case, using data to make decisions is seen as more of a nice to have instead of core to the business. This happens a lot in companies that were already financially successful before starting to make serious investments in analytics. When your business model is already working well without analytics, it can be hard to make the big changes necessary to become data-driven. It's easy to see how an underlying lack of trust in analytics can lead to the first issue I discussed, where this field is used as a weapon. So giving you personal examples of this particular challenge is a bit more nuanced than the previous ones, because stakeholders aren't generally going to come up to you and say, I don't trust analytics, or I don't trust your work. But you can generally figure out if you're having this issue from certain incidents. For example, I've been in the situation of proposing or even prototyping a predictive model to support a decision that's currently being made in the business by gut instinct. But my business stakeholders weren't interested. To me, this tells me that they either don't trust analytics or don't trust my work. Either way, the root issue is a lack of trust. That's a fairly simple example with a specific stakeholder. But you can gauge your organization's overall trust in analytics with a simple heuristic. Who's the highest ranking person that regularly talks about data and considers it a priority and competitive edge? I've worked at companies where this person was the CEO, which is fantastic news for analytics teams. You might still run into issues from the other challenges I discussed, but having that high level support of analytics is a really encouraging sign. On the other hand, I've also worked at companies where my boss, who was some level of data science manager, was essentially the most senior person to regularly promote and talk about analytics. If that's your situation, it's certainly not insurmountable, but you should recognize the lay of the land and understand that you'll likely have to do a lot of relationship building with stakeholders to increase trust. My suggestions for this challenge are really about getting the business to take analytics more seriously. Another way to think about this is trying to create a data-driven culture at your company, an environment where people default to making decisions using data. But overall, building trust is definitely not something you can achieve overnight. Achieving this in any case is going to take some time. One approach you can take is being intentional about building an analytics community. Find colleagues who are not on your team, but who are already doing some type of analytics work as part of their role. It might not be their full-time job, but still an important part of their responsibilities. You should build relationships with these coworkers and look for opportunities to collaborate. At a more organizational level, you can create forums for education and awareness around analytics. The trainings I mentioned before are a great way to start building this community. Other ideas include study groups, a lunch and learn series, or a newsletter. Make these open to anyone remotely interested in or connected to analytics. These ideas are also great opportunities to show off your team's work and expertise. Ideally, they'll result in the cross-pollination of best analytics practices and development of a data-driven culture. Regularly promoting the analytics work that's going on at your company is a great way to win over the skeptics. The point of doing all this is to highlight all of the people and areas of the business that are already using analytics in some way. In addition, you want to foster trust in your team's capabilities. Building up the awareness and profile of analytics makes it more likely that the highest levels of your company will value this field and use it to its full potential. Another important part of building trust is communication. That's what the second suggestion here, communicating with a selling mindset, is really all about. Too often, analytics professionals communicate model results in terms of coefficients or statistical significance. This might be fine for your technical stakeholders, but in general will not work for your business partners. Data scientists or analysts sometimes assume that if their work is technically sound, the business will be convinced. Often, this is simply not the case. Instead, you need to take a selling mindset to how you communicate your work. You can't throw a bunch of technical jargon at a non-technical person and expect them to be convinced. You need to communicate outcomes in a way that the business cares about and understands. Analytics simply does not come naturally to many non-technical people, and they might feel intimidated by the subject. So how should you communicate your results? This can vary depending on your organization and use case, but my advice here is pretty simple. Don't focus on the technical aspects of your work. Instead, talk about money or time. Quantify how much additional money can be made or how much money or time can be saved from a project. Always present your results in these terms or whatever terms matter for your company to make it clear to your stakeholders why they should care about your work. Communicating with this sort of selling mindset is frankly a skill that doesn't come naturally to many analytics professionals. Fortunately, you can learn and develop it just like any other skill. As a starting point, always understand your audience and cater to their preferences. When presenting to your fellow data scientists or analysts, feel free to dive into the technical methods and details. Even when presenting to business stakeholders, it's still appropriate to include high-level methods and educate them about analytics. But when you're talking to the business, always focus on the potential business impact and why they should care about what you're presenting. Communicating with a selling mindset is a general approach that you should use whenever interacting with the business. Next, I want to talk about more tactical recommendations on how to use your projects as a vehicle to build trust within your company. First, let me describe a really stereotypical generic workflow for analytics projects that you should definitely avoid. Too often, the analytics team comes up with a great idea, has a kickoff meeting with the relevant stakeholders, and then goes off on their own for weeks or even months before coming back with results. These results are highly technical, the business stakeholders don't really understand them or the methods used to get them. And besides all of that, business stakeholders' overall level of interest in the project is only lukewarm anyway. As a result, the project ultimately isn't used to its full potential or even at all. This is obviously not how you want things to turn out. Luckily, there are several ways to improve on this workflow. Before even starting work on a project idea, there are a few things you should do. First, ensure that you have a business sponsor or champion. Basically, this boils down to asking yourself, is there someone in the business and not on my analytics team that's excited about this project and will advocate for it? If you offer to do some analysis or build a model for one of your stakeholders, they'll probably say yes. Why would they turn down free work? But that's simply not enough. What you really want before starting a project is to make sure that your stakeholders are interested enough in what you're building that they'll use the outputs and fight for you out in the business. Without getting that buy-in, you risk building something that won't be used. In addition to finding a sponsor, you should also take the time to estimate what the business value will be, commonly referred to as sizing the prize. Come up with a rough idea of what your project is worth. This ties in really closely with the selling analytics mindset that I discussed earlier. And of course, sizing the potential impact of a project ensures that you're pursuing worthwhile opportunities and lets you eliminate low value ones. Keep in mind that any sizing that you do will be a ballpark estimate. Use some reasonable assumptions and back of the envelope calculations to just get a general sense of how much a project is worth. When discussing your work with any business stakeholder, you can lead with these estimates and immediately grab their interest. The final step that I would recommend when evaluating an idea is coming up with a rough plan to implement your project. Whether the output is a dashboard or a deep learning model, you should know how it will be used before devoting time to developing it. Understand who your end user will be, how they'll use what you're thinking of building, and most importantly, how the product will impact the business. This mindset ensures that you build a useful and usable tool. Your business sponsor should definitely be a key part of these conversations. If no one in the business or on your team can come up with a way to implement your work, that's a big red flag for that particular idea. So now let's say you have a project picked out with a champion in the business to fight for it, a rough sizing of the opportunity, and a solid plan for implementation. Now what? In terms of the actual analysis, I recommend always starting with the descriptive analysis phase. With predictive modeling work in particular, it can be really tempting to collect your data and immediately start trying out the latest and greatest algorithms. However, starting with basic descriptive work typically yields better results long-term. Validate some basic counts and quantities with the business, replicate prior results, make sure that everyone agrees on simple benchmarks and metrics. If your preliminary results are different, you can find out why and reconcile early on in the project. Overall, going through this descriptive phase with the business is yet another way to build trust between parties and build trust in your ultimate outputs. In the stereotypical workflow I described previously, the analytics team worked mostly in isolation until the results were ready. This is exactly the wrong way to work on a project. You should include your business sponsor and any other relevant stakeholders every step of the way. You can use your work together as an opportunity to educate them about analytics and build trust. Make sure to present progress and results at weekly or twice a week meetings, but in addition, teach them about the methods you're using and the assumptions you're making. When you're showing results, I tend to lean towards using visualizations over text or tables. A well-designed visualization can crystallize key insights in a way that really resonates. Overall, recognize that working together on a project is a great opportunity to build strong stakeholder relationships. And strong stakeholder relationships are really the key to your team's success. Finally, be sure to seek out your stakeholders' domain knowledge. Especially in the descriptive analysis phase, your stakeholders can teach you a lot about the way the business thinks about things. Incorporating domain knowledge into your work will let you avoid pitfalls and almost certainly will improve your ultimate results. Using projects to cultivate stakeholder relationships in this way builds stakeholder trust, builds investment in the project, and builds confidence in the results, all of which makes it more likely that the outputs will be used effectively. It also ensures that your stakeholders become promoters of your team's work. Over time, creating these promoters in the business is the best way to foster trust in analytics at an organizational level. The final point I'll make on building trust is that most of these recommendations become virtuous cycles. For example, communicating analytics with a selling mindset builds trust with the business, which in turn makes it easier to communicate your work in the future. So now I want to switch gears a little bit. While the previous topics have covered fairly tactical tips to maximize the impact of analytics teams, now I'd like to talk about the more strategic issue of where to position an analytics team within your org structure. This might not be incredibly relevant to a brand new tiny team, but will matter more and more as the analytics function grows in size and scope. As a starting point, I'll talk about 3 common models, really 2.5, for analytics team structure. The first is the centralized model. Just like it sounds, in this case, the analytics team sits in its own department. This is sometimes known as a center of excellence. The team obviously still works with the business, but organizationally and likely culturally, it lives separately. The opposite of this is the decentralized model. This is a distributed model where analytics staff are located in relevant business units or departments. In this case, there's no central analytics team. And then finally, there are various ways that you can combine these 2 types of models for some sort of hybrid model. So the main benefit of a centralized model, in my view, is that analytics professionals get to work with and learn from each other. Ideas and best practices are going to spread much more quickly this way. However, working closely with the rest of the analytics team typically comes at the expense of working closely with the business. That brings me to the major upside of the decentralized model, which is that data scientists and analysts really become a part of the business teams that they're working with. For a well-established analytics department, I think the centralized model works just fine. But for a smaller or a newer analytics team that's still getting established, I would strongly recommend a decentralized model or at least some sort of hybrid version. Many of the concepts that I've discussed today, like building trust and strong stakeholder relationships, really depend on a strong link with the business. Sitting in a separate department makes it too easy for the analytics team to be viewed as an outsider. Integrating with relevant business teams as closely as possible maximizes the likelihood of successfully integrating analytics into the business. So those are all the planned remarks that I have for today. I hope that these strategies will help you build the most efficient and impactful analytics teams possible. Thanks everyone for your time. I've included my contact info on the slide here, so feel free to send over any tips of your own or feedback on this talk. At this point, I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Jay. Any questions from our guest attendees? They can ask your question via the Wova app. There is a session Q&A there, and there's also a chat function. So please feel free to ask any questions. We have 10 minutes left, or any other comments you would like Jay to touch on.
Jay, can you put your contact info back up for a little bit longer, please?
Yep.
And I can probably even put it into the chat on the WOBA. Thank you.
Sure, and I just shared it. Yep.
Just some of the comments on WOBA. People seem to love it. Well done, clear, crisp, and useful. Jay, if you don't mind, I would like to follow up on the culture. Sometimes analytics are welcomed, and people want that valuable data to back up either their products, their sales, their company. How do you deal with when there isn't that support? I know you mentioned you find a sponsor of like, but that is a challenge when you don't have that support. How do you deal with that, and what do you recommend?
Definitely. I think you called out an important challenge. So I think in that case, I think I would go back to really identifying who those stakeholders are that are bought into analytics, that think it can be useful. Focusing there, kind of starting out small, getting a foothold, and working your way up from there. So really prioritizing the people who are already on board with analytics, and then working your way up. In addition, for a more organizational point of view, I think some of the tips around building a community can kind of identify a lot of people who are already using analytics. In my opinion, at least, when there's a lot of resistance to analytics, there's still probably a lot of great analytics work going on in an organization. It might just be called business intelligence or reporting or something else that people are more comfortable with, but that work is still probably going on. And I bet there are people in your organization that you can corral and kind of bring together to highlight the role. And hopefully doing those things, you can eventually build that momentum and kind of get more and more people, and especially the skeptics, to see the value.
Great, thank you. That was a great answer. I'm just going to read one question that was posted, and it's very, I think, around the same topic here. I'm interested in learning more about recommendations on how to break down silos and work with analytics across the organization, especially in large and older companies where there may be a lot of resistance to change analytics.
Absolutely. So I would again reiterate that focus point, and I would just kind of resist the temptation. I think there's always strong temptation to try and work with everyone, try and show some value for every department, and really show how analytics can be this tidal wave of change. I would actually resist that. I would kind of focus again where you have stakeholders that are already bought in, show small wins, incremental progress in a small and specific area. I think you're on mute, Ozzy.
Yes, I am. My last question is, sometimes we're challenged with getting data from different sources, right? Sometimes through analytics, all kinds of different sources. Where do you start? What are some of the questions and answers that you're trying to solve in the beginning when you don't have the stakeholders and you have the data in front of you? What are some of like the top high level questions you're trying to answer with analytics? Can you speak on that, how you organize that initially?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think at that stage, after kind of getting a very, very basic understanding of the data, I think you really need to go out into the business and find out what your stakeholders care about, or find potential stakeholders. I think that's a very common trap that analytics teams fall into. They see some data, they think about all these cool things they can do with it, but when they go out into the business, their stakeholders aren't as excited. And so I think it's incredibly important to let the business lead that and let them show you what they're most interested in. And then you can prioritize your efforts and make sure you're building things that are worthwhile. Another thing I'll mention is really reiterating that communicating with a selling mindset. The business might want something from your team. You might be able to build them a great product, whether it's a dashboard or a model. But if you go back and show it to them in terms that they don't understand, they're just not going to care about it because they're not seeing the value. And so it's just critical to communicate to them in terms that they care about. Again, whatever that might differ for your company, but typically communicating in terms of money or time is going to be fine.
Got it. Thank you. One more question. What tools would you recommend for someone that is getting ready to start working on analytics in their team and their company? Maybe they played around with it, but now they want to get a little bit more serious with it. What tools do you recommend for them to gather analytics and for them to just organize?
Sure, absolutely. So I think the top two that come to mind are definitely Python and SQL to get into the data, explore it. R is another one, my personal favorite. And then finally, I think there's a lot of great BI software out there nowadays. Something I've played around a little bit with is Tableau. I think that those sorts of tools are great because they let you easily dive into the data. And I think it's more likely that some of your stakeholders out in the business, even if they're not data scientists or analysts, they might already be more familiar with those tools. And so it can be easy to find that common ground and really communicate with your stakeholders in a way that they understand. So those are the tools that come to mind.
Okay, great. Thank you. I think those are all the questions I have. I think that is all. I'd like to thank you, Jay Bensal, for your presentation, and I appreciate all the attendees for the questions and interactions during the session. Please contact the speaker if you have any further questions regarding this topic. Please provide your comment and feedback to us or the organizers on the community board, or start a discussion there to connect with others in DataCon LA 2020 community. Thank you for joining today's presentation, and I hope you can gain some insights from the session. Have a wonderful day, and thank you for being part of Leaders DataCon LA. Thank you, Jay.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Ozzy. Thanks, Michelle.